Hello everybody, welcome back to the Jerbee Apiary, where we are harvesting honey from the flow hive for the first time. First, I want to talk a little bit about the way that the flow hive works as a little bit of a recap, or for those that haven't seen this before, and then I'll show you how the harvest went and a breakdown of the hive. The idea behind the flow hive is to have an easier time with harvesting with least amount of disruption and easy cleanup without having to spin the frames. Frames themselves are made out of plastic, and they have deeper wells than a standard beehive honeycomb will, so the queen doesn't tend to lay in them, or you can use a queen excluder. The idea is that everything would drain down from these frames after you disrupt the plastic honeycomb on the inside through these areas where you can remove these caps and put little drain tubes. The way you do this is by using a very long metal rod that is inserted into a space at the top of the frames that is utilized in order to shift or change the configuration of the plastic cells so that they split. This allows the honey to flow to the bottom of the frame and then out through those tubes and the drains in the bottom. The concept here being that you would disrupt the bees the least amount by not opening up the hive and tearing everything apart in order to harvest, and you also don't need to spin your frames afterwards. And if everything goes well, you can also put the frames back in place if you're having a lot of honey flow and you have a very successful year with your hive, and simply reset the cells so that they're back in the storage configuration. My flow hive is a cedar hive, and you can see that there are quite a few frames associated with this. This does fit on a 10 frame setup, even though there are only 7 flow frames because of their extra cell depth. I'm sorry, we do not have a license for this vehicle. You need to cease and desist immediately. The chickens are always as beneficial as ever in helping out with any kind of harvesting processes. So here you can see that we have some tapped flow frames, and it drains directly then into these jars. It actually worked pretty well. I will say overall the honey was probably a little bit wetter than I would have liked, but this was already in mid to late October and it was time to get some harvesting done. Here you can see things sped up a little bit as we shift everything in order to put other jars and pans and everything else to collect the honey. Ideally, you would have a very large jar, and that way you could probably drain an entire frame without needing to constantly shift things or change jars. You'd be surprised by how much honey comes out of each one of these frames. I didn't have any issues with bees coming into the back, although I was wearing a suit. There weren't any kind of intruders. They didn't really seem to care very much this was going on as far as I can tell, and it was a very calm and peaceful experience. If anything, the only thing I did see were a couple of yellow jackets that were trying to get into the honey. The process was pretty easy and straightforward, and it really wasn't all that messy, and I think it was actually a good experience overall. I didn't have any kind of problems, and I think that's a good part of it. And I would definitely say it's worth checking out this hive. It's very interesting the way that this works. And you can see the bees after harvest. They're just crawling around on the inside on the capped frames, just wondering what's going on. And really, like I said, they really weren't all that bothered by things. Because I didn't have a lot of big jars when everything was tapped at the same time, it did get a little bit hectic, especially when you had some that are just still slowly trickling and you run out of hands. Probably would have benefited from having another table there. I let everything settle for a day, and then the next day I broke down the hive because it was the end of the season. You can see the bees had already started breaking down any of the wax cappings that were there, and I didn't want them to try to refill everything again. So then what I did was essentially take those frames and I would brush the bees off of them, and then take out each frame one at a time and place them at the side of the hive, so that way I can place them somewhere near the bee yard overall that they can pick any kind of nectar or honey that's left over off of there. The rest of the process was removing the flow frame deep overall box and then getting at where the queen excluder was underneath. Now again, queen excluder maybe not entirely necessary on a flow hive because the queen doesn't tend to lay in the flow frames, although it has been reported, so I thought it was better just to use one. So I took off the queen excluder then. We are getting ready for winter after all in this video, and then put on my inner cover. And on that inner cover I do have just some screens so that the bees didn't come flying out into the top part of it. And the rest of it was just doing final assembly of the roof. And later on into winter I actually insulated that with some straw and put another box on top of that just as a spacer. All told, the breakdown and reassembly process upset them far more than any harvesting did, but overall, really, they were okay with everything and they readjusted pretty quickly. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments field below. Remember to like and subscribe if you could, and as always, thank you for joining me here at the Jerbee Apiary.